Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to make old weathered shingles from balsa wood. So let's get started with the wood. I start with 1/32 by 3 inch by 36 inch balsa wood sheets. The first thing I do is roughen up the surface using a wire brush. This adds a nice, pronounced, rough texture to the balsa and it looks really convincing once painted. Here's before the wire brush texturing, and here's after. Next, I use an old toothbrush to wipe away all of the excess fuzzy splinters that are left behind from the wire brush. And now, I mark and cut out multiple strips of balsa that are 3/4 of an inch wide. I use the back of my X-Acto blade to texture the bottom side of the strip, and this will add even more rough texture and decay to the bottom of our shingles, which can be seen in many reference images. To make the individual shingles, I simply snap them off the strip. My references show a variety of different widths, so I'm not being too careful to get the exact same size. I begin to arrange the loose shingles into a row, and I make sure to have some placed at slightly different heights to add some variation. I apply the second row of shingles over the first using super glue. I overlap them roughly 1/4 inch, and I'm mindful not to be too regular with their pattern. I repeat this process for the rest of the rows, and because I'm only doing a sample size for this video, I'm only gluing the shingles to themselves. However, most of the time I'd glue them to framework or a piece of board acting as the frame for a roof. And here are the assembled shingles before painting. The next step is to seal them with shellac, which will make them less porous and slightly more rigid. And now, I'm applying a highly diluted acrylic black wash all over the surface. This acts as a nice base coat for our old wood effect. Some of you could stop here depending on your project, but I'm going for a more grayish white faded wood look. So while the surface is still wet, I apply Vallejo deck tan, buff, and white to individual shingles, each color highly diluted with water. The effect looks really strong at this stage, but it'll be toned down once it dries. After everything completely dries, I add a very light dry brush layer of acrylic white paint to the surface to pull out some of the raised details and to unify our different colored shingles. Next, I add some of the same black wash we used earlier under each row of shingles to apply subtle shadows. I also apply it to shingles that I think could be a little bit darker. And here's the finished old wood effect. You could leave it as is, but I'm going to add some growth along the bottom edge. I'm borrowing this technique from Night Shift, a YouTuber that primarily makes tank models and dioramas. First, I'm applying dots of matte Mod Podge to where I want some moss. Then, I add some Woodland Scenics green grass fine turf over the surface, and I shake away the excess material. I repeat this process until I'm happy with the coverage. The fine turf adds a nice texture, but the color is wrong. So I add some highly diluted raw sienna to the moss. Again, this yellow color looks pretty stark when it's wet, but it'll be much more subdued when it dries. I apply this color over all of the mossy spots, and the excess paint that gets on the shingles will help blend the moss onto the surface. While the paint is still wet, I add another coat using Van Dyke Brown. This tones down the yellow and it adds some nice dark grimy tones to the moss. It also acts as a pin wash and brings out the texture of the fine turf that we added earlier. Next, I add a very controlled highlight layer using green gold to the mossy spots. This brings out the vibrancy of the moss and it helps make it look like it's alive. I make sure not to cover all of the previous two steps, and I also add this color to some of the shingles to blend the colors more with the surface of the wood. And lastly, I speckle a wash of raw sienna over the entire roof by flicking it on with a brush. This adds some nice texture and color to the entire surface. And here's the final result. I hope you learned something and that you found this video useful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Also, a huge shout out to my patrons. Thank you so much for all of your support. If you'd like to join them and support me even further, please consider joining my Patreon. I offer tons of content such as process pictures between videos, early access videos, and much more. Well anyways, thank you for watching and I hope to see you in the next video. Also, here are some bloopers. I'm borrowing this technique from a... I'm borrowing this... And here's the final result. I hope you learned something. And here's the final result.